On the freezing evening of December 26, 1991, a man walked out onto the roof of the Kremlin in Moscow. He lowered a red flag with a hammer and sickle. He raised a tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. It was a quiet moment. There were no explosions. There were no invading armies marching into Red Square. But in that moment, one of the two most powerful empires in human history simply evaporated. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. We look back at history and think it was inevitable. We think, of course, communism failed. It was inefficient. But if you lived in 1980, the Soviet Union looked eternal. They had more nuclear weapons than the United States. They had a massive army. They had satellites in space. They controlled half of Europe. The CIA estimated their economy was growing. And yet, from the moment the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 to the moment the flag came down in 1991, it took less than 900 days. 3 years. That is how long it takes for a superpower to go from invincible to memory. Why does this matter to you, sitting in America or Europe in 2025? Because you are suffering from normalcy bias. You think that because the United States has been the hegemon for your entire life, it always will be. You think the dollar is the sun around which the financial solar system revolves. The Soviet citizens thought the same thing about the ruble. They thought their pensions were safe. They thought the state would always provide. When the collapse came, it didn't come as a slow decline. It came as a trapdoor opening. The Soviet Union didn't die from a military defeat. It died from economic exhaustion. They spent 20% of their GDP on the military to keep up with America. They printed money to subsidize bread and fuel prices to keep the population quiet. They lied about their production numbers. They borrowed heavily from foreign banks. On paper, the system still worked. In reality, it was eating itself alive. Does any of this sound familiar? Look at the United States in 2025. We spend nearly $1 trillion a year on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined, while our infrastructure rots. We print trillions to subsidize the bond market, the housing market, and the welfare state. We massage our inflation numbers and count part-time jobs as full employment. We sit on $37 trillion of federal debt, much of it ultimately financed by the rest of the world. We look disturbingly like the Soviet Union in 1988. The facade is still shiny. The flags still wave, but down in the engine room, the hull is already taking on water. No, America is not the Soviet Union, but the math doesn't care about flags. The collapse of the USSR teaches us the mechanics of a sovereign currency crack-up. First, the goods disappear. In the USSR, you stood in line for 4 hours for bread. In the US, we call it supply chain disruptions. Then the currency loses trust. The official rate says one thing, the black market says another. In the US, the Fed says inflation is 3%, but your grocery bill tells a different story. Then the periphery starts to pull away. The Baltics left the USSR first. Today, look at the national divorce rhetoric. States are beginning to ask whether the federal government is an asset or a liability. But the most dangerous part of the collapse is what happens to the people. When the Soviet Union fell, life expectancy for Russian men dropped by nearly 10 years. Alcoholism exploded. Crime gangs took over the economy. The savings of the middle class were wiped out by hyperinflation in the 90s. The scientists, the doctors, the engineers, they were driving taxis to survive, or they were selling their expertise to whoever would pay. This is what sovereign default looks like when it happens to a superpower. When an empire of this scale dies, it sucks the oxygen out of the room. The US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. If it collapses, or even if it just loses its monopoly, living standards in America could fall by double digits in a very short window. 30 to 50% over just a few years is not impossible. We export dollars and import goods. If the world stops taking our dollars, the goods stop coming. Imagine a Target or a Walmart with empty shelves, not for a week, for months. That is what happened in Moscow. It can happen in Chicago. The Soviet elite saw it coming. They moved their money to London and Switzerland. They bought assets. They survived. The Soviet worker believed the propaganda on the nightly news. He lost everything. On this anniversary of the fall of the USSR, take a hard look at the American flag. It represents a great idea, but the government beneath it is mathematically bankrupt. Do not confuse the nation with the state. The nation is the people, the land, the culture. The state is the structure currently consuming the host. The Soviet state died. The Russian people survived, but the transition was hell. Here is the architect's protocol for the 900 days. First, move a meaningful portion of your savings outside the dollar system. Gold, Bitcoin, foreign currency, hard assets that don't rely on a politician's promise to hold value. Second, build a buffer of physical resilience. 3 to 6 months of food, water, and essential supplies. If the shelves empty, you are not in the first wave of panic. Third, invest in skills that have value regardless of which flag is flying. Medical knowledge, mechanical repair, food production. The ability to create or fix something real is the only credential that survives a regime change. None of this is personal financial advice. It is a survival framework for a system that is already cracking. When the cracks start to spread, and they already have, speed is your only ally. You cannot wait for the official announcement. By the time the news anchor tells you the dollar is in crisis, the banks will already be limiting withdrawals. The Soviets had 900 days between illusion and collapse. You may not be given that much warning. The flag can come down faster than you think. I am the architect, and I will see you tomorrow.